The knight is a chess piece worth 3 pawns which moves like this. It also happens to be Vishy Anand's favorite chess piece. So in today's video, we are going to be looking at the advantages and drawbacks of this piece, and from there we will conclude some principles by which you can use the knight more efficiently. Let's get started. Firstly, we shall look at some basic advantages and disadvantages of the knight as a piece. Let's talk about the advantages first. Since it moves in an L shape, it can jump over other pieces, making it very useful for attacks where the pawns are very much interlocked and the knight is the only piece that can get close to the enemy. Also, due to this reason, a check from the knight technically cannot be blocked. For example, if a bishop is giving check to a king, you can put a piece in between and the check won't be there anymore. But for a knight, if the knight is giving check to your king, you will either have to capture the knight or move your king. So checks from the knight are actually a bit more harder to deal with for the opponent. It can also attack other pieces without coming under attack itself. Most of the traditional line movers cannot really attack the knight because of their movement. For example, the bishop moves in diagonals, and the knight attacks in an L-shaped manner. So if the knight is attacking a bishop, the bishop cannot attack the knight. This makes the knight very useful for winning material through tactics and motifs like fork. It's a great defender of its king. Due to its movement, it can defend quite a lot of checks from the opposing queen, which other pieces may not do so effectively. Stick around until the end to see some brilliant examples of the knight as a defender. And finally, it isn't affected by closed positions. Since it can jump over pieces, closed positions actually favor the knight as they allow more opportunities for there to be outposts which the knight can use successfully. Now let's talk about some disadvantages of the knight. It is short ranged and slow moving, so it cannot influence matters from afar, unlike a bishop which can attack on the king side while being on the queen side. Although the knight, in contrary, has to be on the king side to actually affect matters on the king side. It can't move to as many squares as other units can, making it easier to trap. Because from the center of the board, the knight can only move to 8 squares, which is not very less, but not as much as how much a queen or a rook or a bishop could move. So it's much easier to trap than those other. It can only play on one side of the board at once. Again, because it's short range and slow moving, being on the king side, it takes time to go to the queen side. So it can only play on one side of the board at once and takes very long to go from one wing of the board to another. It is vulnerable to attack, especially by pawns, since it can't capture back. Remember that advantage we talked about, that the knight can attack other pieces without being attacked? Well, this has come back to haunt him, as it can be attacked without attacking other pieces. For example, if you attack a bishop with the pawn, the bishop has the ability to capture the pawn even if it's not the best move. But still, the bishop can actually capture the pawn in some cases. As for the knight, if it's attacked by a pawn, it has to move because it literally cannot recapture the pawn back. So this makes it vulnerable to attacks when it's not in a secure position. The definition of an outpost is actually a position where the knight cannot be attacked by pawns. And as we shall see, the knight is actually best placed on these squares so that pawns cannot displace it. Based on these advantages and disadvantages, we will now try to look at the conditions which favor the knight. Like I had said, it is best placed on an outpost, from where it cannot be attacked by any enemy pawns. Being attacked by other pieces is fine, but it should not be attacked by any enemy pawn. Also, an outpost is usually defended by a friendly pawn. So in these kind of positions, the knight cannot be attacked by an enemy pawn, but it is defended by its own pawn. So even if it is attacked, it doesn't necessarily have to move, as the only thing that can attack it is the bishop or the rook, both of which don't seem like very good choices to avoid trading. It is better when action is on one side of the board. Obviously, since it's a short range piece, it is better when things are going on one side of the board. That is why they say, right, bring all your toys to the party, and common attacking principle. This is especially true for the knight, since it's very useful only if it's near the attacking zone. And finally, it is an especially powerful attacking force to reckon with when used alongside the queen. Let's see why. The queen is the best of the line moving pieces, since it moves like a rook and a bishop combined. That is why, in unison with the knight, the queen and the knight duo becomes a very powerful force, as the knight moves in its own unique way and the queen is the strongest line mover. So this makes them a very powerful attacking unit. As we shall see in the upcoming examples, the queen and knight duo can actually be quite a devastating attacking unit. Based on our newfound knowledge, we can now condense these facts into 6 simple practical positional principles, followed by some examples to enable you to use the horsey like a real knight. The first is the outpost is best occupied by the knight, from where it cannot be attacked by an enemy pawn and is defended by a friendly pawn. So we'll look at an example of that. Here, the c4 square is the only good outpost which can be easily reached. Since we want to maintain a knight on c4, we play knight e3. So here, c4 cannot be attacked by an enemy pawn, that's very evident. And in the future, we can also defend it with our own friendly pawn by playing b3. On c4, the knight can influence a lot of matters. It can go to b6, it can attack d6, and it is very annoying in general. So that is why we usually occupy an outpost with a knight. We play knight e3 because if we were to play directly knight c4, then he would just take it and we would have another piece like a bishop, which is not as useful on the outpost as a knight, because the pawns get in the way of the bishop. This is why we play knight e3, and in the game black played knight g6, and after knight c4 you can see how many things the knight is influencing, attacking the a5 pawn, attacking the b6 square, attacking the d6 pawn. Black played knight f4 to try and restrict the white bishop. White takes, black takes, and now we play e5. So again we are creating more opportunities for our pieces to open up. The knight can now jump to e4. If black captures the e5 pawn, our d5 pawn can move to d6, and overall white has a lot of opportunities. For example, in the game after d into e5 bishop f3, white's position was simply excellent. Aside from having to win back the pawn on e5, white can also play d6 and attack the rook on a8 as a potential discovery. He can also put his knight on e4 and target the c5 pawn. So basically white has a lot of scope here, and I don't really see how black is going to fend off all these threats. So as you can see, by playing knight e3, we secured an outpost on c4 for our knight. Number 2. The knight is stronger than the bishop in closed positions, so avoid their exchange. Let's look at an example of this also. In this position, as you can see, the knight on d5 is quite powerful, as the black dark squares are weak and the knight is the only real piece that can target these squares effectively. So here, in fact, white played bishop h3. You see, black was threatening to play bishop e6 and then take the knight on d5, as the bishop on d7 isn't really doing much. So he thought that maybe I'll trade it now. And white's bishop on g2 isn't good either. So white decides, why not trade off the bishop, which could potentially trade itself for my knight. So he played bishop h3, and now black took bishop h3. If you try to avoid the exchange by brute force with f5, it actually backfires, because after rook c8, bishop c8, ef5, gf5, queen c4, black's king is slightly airy, which you do not want it to be, and it's gonna come under some serious attack. This is why black took the bishop, and after queen h3, we can see that white's knight is much better placed than the bishop on f8, and although white is not completely winning, it is much easier to be white in this position, and in fact white did eventually go on to win this game. Number 3. When you have a knight, it is generally better to close the center to make the knight as effective as possible. So in this position, as you can see, black has just played the move d5 and he is challenging white's center, and since we have the knights, we play e5. So now we have closed the center and our knights are actually better than black's knight and bishop. Even though he has a knight, there isn't much scope for his horsey, because where will it go? I mean, okay, if you go knight d7, then we just play knight b5 and there are too many weaknesses for black to handle. The knight is jumping to d6, the knight is going to c7, the rook may also potentially come to c7, and I don't really like black's position here. So knight d7 is out of the question. Knight e4 is one potential option to sacrifice the pawn to open up the center for the black bishop, but instead of taking the pawn after d into e4, we play knight d2. And the point of this is that we want to play knight c4, where we're attacking b6 as well as threatening to go to d6. The point is, if you take knight e4, then the whole advantage is lost, right? Because now it's an equal endgame and white's weakness on d4 will eventually be won by black, and it's very difficult to win these kind of positions. So this is why we play knight c4, not going after the pawn. And after rook a b8, knight d6, white's position was much better and he went on to win the game. Let's also look at why white shouldn't take the pawn on e4, because after queen e4, bishop b7, queen e3, black can either take the knight on f3 or play queen d7, when the d4 pawn will come under fire and eventually be lost. So that is why we tried to close the center in this position, so that black's bishop could not gain the activity it desired. Number 4. The knight is the best defender, so it is good to have a knight close to your king when you are under attack. Now this example is probably my favorite, as you get to see the prowess of the knight. Here black has just played queen takes g3 check, and white has a couple of options. He can either block with any minor piece or move his king. Let's see what would happen if black were to play bishop g2. If he played bishop g2, then after queen f2 check, king h4, queen into h4, bishop h3, queen f2, king h1, queen e1, king g2, queen f2, king h1, queen e1, king h2, queen f2, bishop g2, queen h4, we see that the bishop is a light square bishop, so it cannot affect the matters on the dark square. Therefore, it is completely useless when it comes to defending the dark square checks. And after queen h4 check, black was able to get a perpetual check and draw the game. A much better continuation was in fact knight g2. Since the knight blocks the check of the queen on e1, it is not allowing the queen to give many useful checks. And in the game, black decided to take queen h3, and now after queen c6, white is completely winning. If after knight g2 he would have tried queen f2 check, then king h2, queen e2 and queen c6 is still winning, because as you can see here, there are no more checks. The h4 square is also defended and there is a bishop on h3, but still you can see the knight is defending both e1 and h4 from its post on g2. So this is a great example of how a knight is a much better defender than a bishop in these kind of positions. So it's very useful to have a knight near your king in times of peril. Number 5. You should prefer a queen and knight duo to a queen and bishop duo. Since the queen moves on both squares but also moves long range, it's better to have a queen and knight duo, as the knight moves in its own unique way and both combined they are an extremely powerful attacking force. Let's look at an example. Here black is actually looking like he has held the position well, but in fact instead of going for a draw, black decides to play aggressively and plays f5. He's trying to open up the position and get his queen close to the king on d1. So white takes gf5, black takes queen f5, queen b7 and now queen f1 check. After king d2 we have knight b6. So we can see even the sixth principle is in use here, which is to bring your knight into the action. So here we play knight b6, which is threatening knight c4 check, and also we get to see another example of how good a defender the knight is, because after queen into c6 check, which is a very logical move, we play king f5, and now you see the knight from its post on b6 is fending off all the possible checks that white could have given to the black king. And in fact, when white played another move, Took knight c4, king c3, queen f3, king b4, queen a3, king b5, queen a5 mate. So you see the coordination between the knight and the queen is actually very good. This is why the knight and queen duo is usually preferred to a queen and bishop duo. Alright, that's it for today guys. Please make sure to like and subscribe so I can keep making content like this. Until then, I'll see you in the next video, which will probably be about bishops. Bye.